You've seen it happen in real time. Someone asks him a simple question, "How do you feel about this?" And something shifts. Not dramatically, not visibly to most people in the room, but something locks. He doesn't answer immediately. He might reach for his drink. He might glance at something across the room that doesn't require his attention. He might offer a word that sounds like an answer but contains nothing. Fine, good. I don't know, it is what it is. And then the conversation moves on, because that's what conversations do when someone gives them nothing to hold on to. What just happened isn't rudeness. It isn't emotional immaturity in the clinical sense. It isn't avoidance in the way a therapist might diagram it on a whiteboard. What happened is something older than that, something that was already running before he had language for it. Watch him in a different setting. Ask him what's wrong with your car engine and he'll talk for 20 minutes without pausing. Ask him to describe what a bad business decision looks like and he'll reconstruct the entire logic chain from memory. Ask him to explain why a sports team lost and he'll give you a precise, emotionally fluent breakdown of every failure point. He is not a man without language. He is not a man without the capacity for nuanced observation. He has that capacity in abundance in every domain except the one that was never considered a domain at all. The freeze isn't absence of intelligence. The freeze is the boundary of a map that was never drawn. He grew up in a specific cultural window that had very clear, if unspoken, sorting criteria for what counted as real and what counted as noise. Noise was what you felt. Real was what you did with it. The boys around him, his brothers, his classmates, his teammates, his father's friends, were not teaching him this explicitly. Nobody sat him down and delivered a curriculum on emotional suppression. What happened was quieter and far more effective than direct instruction. What happened was consistent modeling of what men do when something hurts. They work.
They fix something. They go quiet and come back when the problem is solved. They don't narrate the interior of the process. The narration was never part of the job. So when he was 8 and something frightened him, the response he observed wasn't, "Let's talk about fear." The response he observed was motion. When something made him angry at 12, the useful version of anger was the one that got channeled into competition, into performance, into becoming faster or stronger or better at something measurable. The anger that sat still and examined itself served no visible function. When something made him sad at 16, sadness was a private room you passed through alone as quickly as possible, and you didn't leave the door open. He absorbed all of this without being told to absorb it. That's how the deepest conditioning works. It doesn't announce itself. It becomes the texture of normal. By the time he reached his 20s, something significant had already happened beneath the surface. He had not simply learned to suppress emotional expression. He had reorganized his internal architecture around a different primary function. Feelings were still occurring, he was never without them, but their role in his cognitive system had shifted from signal requiring response to background data requiring management. You manage background data by keeping it stable enough not to interfere with the foreground task. You don't investigate it, you don't report on it, you stabilize it and return your attention to what's in front of you. This wasn't dysfunction. Inside the environment he was operating in, this was extraordinarily functional. It made him reliable under pressure. It made him capable of compartmentalization that others found both admirable and slightly unnerving. It made him the person people called when things were falling apart, because he could stay operational when operational was what was needed. He was good at this. He got better at it every decade. But here is what 3 decades of optimization inside a system will do. It doesn't just train the behavior, it restructures the feedback loop. By his late 30s, the management of emotional data had become so efficient, so automatic, that the signal was being processed and stabilized before it ever reached the layer of consciousness where language lives. He wasn't suppressing feelings in real time. He had built a system that handled them before they reached the verbal interface. So when someone asks, "How do you feel?" the honest answer, if the system could speak for itself, would be,
I don't know yet, because the part of me that would translate that into language never got the information. That's not deflection. That's a structural description of what's actually happening in the moment. The freeze is the observable surface of that structure making contact with an input it was never designed to process at speed. Emotional language requires access to real-time internal state. Real-time internal state requires a monitoring function that stays close to the signal. He built his monitoring function to stay close to the external signal, the problem, the task, the other person's need, the situation requiring management. The internal signal was always downstream, always secondary, always the thing you came back to later if later ever arrived. Later rarely arrived, and when it didn't, the signal was absorbed back into the system as something that had been handled. This is why he isn't lying when he says, "I'm fine." He genuinely cannot access the counter-evidence quickly enough to offer you something more precise. The more precise information exists somewhere in the system, but the retrieval pathway is slow, uncertain, and critically was never built for public use. It was built, if it was built at all, for private navigation in the dark, at 2 a.m. when the house is quiet and the management functions have briefly relaxed. That's when he knows what he feels. That's when the data that's been stabilized all day becomes briefly readable. But nobody is asking him at 2 a.m. They're asking him in the kitchen or in a meeting or in the middle of a conversation that has its own forward momentum. And in those moments, the system gives him what it's been optimized to give: a stable, functional, socially adequate non-answer. Watch how he relates to other men his age around this. There's something particular that happens in groups of Gen X men when emotional content enters the room. Nobody declared the rules of this, nobody enforces them with explicit language, but the rules are there, and everyone in the room knows them with the precision of someone who has been practicing them for 40 years. You can reference difficulty obliquely. You can mention something hard happened without describing the texture of it. You can use humor to mark the territory of pain without entering it. What you cannot do is remain in direct, unironic, first-person emotional disclosure for more than a few seconds without someone shifting the energy. Not because anyone wants to be unkind, because the shift is reflexive, because the group has its own version of the same management system he built individually. The collective norm and the private architecture reinforce each other so completely that neither one is visible as a system. They just feel like how things are. This is the layer that rarely gets examined. The individual freeze is visible. The cultural architecture underneath it is almost entirely transparent. He didn't build this alone. He built it inside a generation that was itself inside a specific set of economic and social conditions that made this particular emotional structure not just common, but adaptive.
The Gen X male entered the workforce during a period of profound economic instability and rapid restructuring. The emotional posture that served him best was not one of expressed vulnerability. It was one of demonstrated competence and reliable steadiness. Employers didn't reward men who talked about what they were experiencing. They rewarded men who produced outcomes in spite of what they were experiencing. So the management system wasn't just psychologically convenient, it was economically selected for. Across 2 or 3 decades of professional conditioning layered onto childhood conditioning, the structure became nearly total. And then something happened to many men in this generation that the structure was not built to process. The world asked them to become different kinds of men. Not all at once, not with a clear directive, but gradually the cultural expectations around emotional expression, around relationship presence, around the interior life of a man, all of it began shifting in ways that the existing architecture had no protocol for. Partners began asking for something he didn't have language to provide. Children, especially in their teenage years, began needing a kind of emotional presence that required him to know what he was feeling in real time. Conversations that his father's generation would have navigated with silence were now conversations that required him to show up differently. But the architecture doesn't restructure on request. It restructures through sustained, specific, often uncomfortable new practice. The kind of practice that feels, to a system built for efficiency, like profound waste of resources. So he remained largely himself, not from stubbornness, not from unwillingness, from the basic principle that a system optimized over 40 years doesn't respond to a single moment of new information. The freeze, then, is not a wall. The freeze is the visible edge of a very old, very sophisticated adaptive structure meeting a moment it wasn't designed for. It runs in him. It runs, with variation, in most men his age. It ran in the men who raised them. It is not pathology. It is the outcome of a particular cultural and developmental sequence distributed across a generation, operating beneath the level of conscious choice for so long that it became indistinguishable from personality. He doesn't freeze because he doesn't care. He freezes because the caring runs through a system that was built to carry weight silently. And silence for 40 years was not a failure, it was the job. What remains visible, once you've traced this structure to its foundation, is something that goes beyond the individual man in front of you. Every Gen X man who freezes at that question is carrying, without knowing it, the same invisible weight. Not their personal history alone, but the accumulated adaptive logic of an entire generation shaped by the same cultural pressures, the same unspoken contracts, the same 40 years of optimization inside a system that never once asked them how they felt. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And a pattern at that scale is never about the individual. It is about the water they all learned to breathe in.